Okay, I'd like to welcome everyone to our 25th anniversary session here that we have with some of our founders. I just feel so honored to be in this session and to meet you all. And I look forward to hearing your thoughts on some of the questions that we all have agreed to start us off. But I'd first like everyone, the co-facilitators, to introduce themselves. So maybe we could start with Vicki Golick.
Okay, hi, I'm Vicki Golick. Recently retired, yay.
Yay.
June 30 from my position at Metropolitan State University of Denver, where I was provost and executive vice president for academic affairs.
Excellent, thank you. And Susan Northcutt.
Good afternoon, I'm Susan Northcutt. I am retired also several years from the University of South Florida. And I'm asked now about, pain pills and bone scans and assisted living and lifelong learning. That's where my advice is directed these days.
Thank you. And Mary.
Hi, everybody. I'm Mary Meyer-McAleese. I'm a professor of political science at Eckerd College, and I'm getting to the stage where I'm thinking about retirement. But I still have a few years left, but I'm definitely thinking about it now. So
great, thanks, Meredith.
Hi, I'm Meredith Reed Sarkis, and I'm also retired, and I've done a lot of work in terms of gathering the data on the status of women in the profession. And the other area that I do a lot of research in is the Correlates of War Project.
Great, thank you. And finally, we have Galia.
Oh, me?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm definitely retired. I continue to teach one graduate seminar, one semester. I'm retired professor from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and I give this one seminar at a private college near my house, which I really love doing because I like the contact with the students, and it's a course that I can do in my sleep. So I think, by the way, retirement is not an easy thing. I think those of you who are just approaching it, beware. It's a very big step. But I found a lot of things to keep me busy, and I think that was really important. So
great. Okay, so we have 4 questions that we'd like to get to, and then also engage with the audience on some of these questions. The first one we thought we would go over is, what were your early experiences with the field of international studies? That is, as a graduate student. So who'd ever like to take that one, feel free. Great, Susan.
Perhaps I'll go first because my graduate education was in the 1960s.
Yeah, mine too.
Oh, good. It was at Indiana University. I arrived and I was one of, out of 110, 120 graduate students in the Department of Government and Politics. There were only 7, perhaps 9 women.
Oh, God.
The campus itself was lively because there were weekly anti-war demonstrations, but it was very lively in the department as well, because quantitative IR and behavioral IR were being introduced into the academic field. The director of graduate studies at IU was Eleanor Ostrom. She was ABD from Berkeley, and decades later, she received the Nobel Prize in Economics. Mm-hmm. My dissertation advisor was Dina Zinnes, who later became president of ISA.
Yeah.
While I was at IU, I was the only woman in IR seminars, the only woman in methodology. Those were the 2 fields that I emphasized. And I was the only female TA, as a matter of fact, which at least right now means a lot to me. But it's the revolution and the radicalization of the discipline in terms of quantification and behavioral studies that that strike me as most important. No mention of ISA, by the way, in my graduate education. The APSA was talked about, but not ISA.
Mhm.
Ilya?
I was the first woman political scientist in Israel ever, period. My BA was in philosophy, and I did my graduate work in Paris as an East European specialist. That was my field. I wasn't in IR. And when I came into the political science department in Jerusalem, they had just created an IR department, which I did not join because I was in Russian studies and political science, and I couldn't do a third department. So I've never been in IR directly, but I always gave a course on Soviet policy in the Middle East in the IR department. And so I had lots and lots and lots of IR students. All the Israeli ambassadors today were my students, and a lot of the politicians and prime ministers and so on. I'm not always proud of the fact, a number of cases, but every rank that I had, I was the first woman since the Second Temple. That's the way I was introduced by one of my male colleagues. Today, both departments have a lot of political science and IR have a number of women, some fabulous feminist women and political scientists and an IR whom I know and I've worked with. And things have changed enormously. Now they're still a very, 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 very small minority, maybe 10%. But it's not like it was when I came into the field. When you're old, you can go back to the 60s and that's how they look. 60s were amazing, but they changed. Times have changed.
I'll go next. I didn't start my graduate studies in the 60s. I finally got my doctorate in 1984, but it took way too long for me to get my doctorate. But I went to the University of Southern California. And at that time, James Rosenau was there. So they did talk a lot about ISA, and they did not talk about APSA at all. In fact, the political science department and the School of International Relations were completely separate, and the faculty didn't talk to each other. It was pretty funny.
Yeah, I get it.
As the case may be. Sort of my strange stories, sort of two of them, I guess. I started graduate school pregnant. Somebody forgot to tell me that the saying about sleep like a baby is a big lie. Yeah. So I actually thought babies slept, and gave birth in my second semester to a very, very colicky baby, and have on my transcript a spring semester with withdraw fail on them. Because the baby was born after the date, all those technicalities that you have to deal with. But those were also the days where one of the faculty members referred to me as getting ready to pop a squealy. Yeah. That part was really weird. I too was sort of surprised that in the 1980s, when I went to, when I started my program, or late 70s, that statistics and quantitative science of international relations was such a big deal. I still had the option to either take a statistics exam or a foreign language exam as part of the entrance to a PhD program. And I had just returned from studying in Germany for 18 months. So I chose the German exam, which I passed. So I never, don't want to insult anybody, but I never fully understood the focus on quantitative IR. But I did discover international political economy, which ended up being sort of my savior. because I absolutely loved it, and I'm grateful for all the faculty who helped me get through that process. The one other thing I would add here is that not only did those of us sitting here choose a male-dominated discipline, AKA International Studies, then I decided to choose a male-dominated field of aviation and commercial aircraft manufacturing. So I sort of had a double whammy there, and can tell some stories later if there's time.
Well, I don't know if Heidi or I go chronologically next. I'm not entirely sure, but my story is a little different. When I was growing up, it was never encouraged in me to pursue a career. I didn't ever believe I was going to have a career. None of my friends' mothers worked. And so I was basically encouraged to pursue education for its own sake, not for having a career. But I was interested in politics. And after getting my master's, I went off and I decided to work for county government. And the first day of my job, I walked in and my boss looked at me and he said, well, the legislature met last night and they decided that since you're not a man with a family to support, we're going to cut your pay 20%.
Oh,
So I decided that, yeah, being a woman was not really being welcomed in government. And so after dealing with these people for a while, I decided to go back to school. And so I got into a doctoral program and already had my master's at this point. But I had my fields were IR and US foreign policy. And the first day in the foreign policy class I walked in, and there were very few women in the department at all. And is my picture still working?
Yes.
Okay. But I went into the program and there were very few women. Most of the women in the class were actually doing sort of regional studies, area studies, very few in IR per se. And so the professor walked in the first day of class and he said, I don't want any foreign students in this class because you can't speak English well enough. I want you to drop out immediately.
whoa.
And I don't want any women in the class because women can't understand power. And so I want you to drop out immediately.
Where was this? What university?
University of Buffalo. And so of course, by the next class, I was the only woman in the class. And so it was obviously not a pleasurable experience from some of the faculty. They were not particularly welcoming of women. But the same was also true of the other students. At the time, the university was going through this massive expansion. And so they were giving graduate students offices in a dorm. And so I walked in the first day and the two guys I was supposed to be sharing this office with had divided up the room between the two of them, spread all their stuff out, and put my desk in the closet. I couldn't even put a chair in there. So needless to say, I didn't feel very welcomed at the department. But
Wow.
yeah.
Wow. Well, that's a great story. Wow.
So I guess, am I next then? So where to start? I had always been interested in international studies. That was my major as an undergraduate, along with French. And then I did a master's at University of South Florida in political science, but all my courses were focused in IR and comparative. And as everyone else has indicated, I was one of the few women in the classroom, certainly at the master's level. But I always had this idea that I would go on to the Foreign Service. I wanted to be a diplomat because I loved languages and travel and blah, blah, blah. Well, so I took the Foreign Service exam and failed the English portion of the exam. This was after I had come back from spending a year studying in France. And come to find out, I was part of the class action suit against the US State Department for gender bias. in the Foreign Service exam. And I didn't realize it at the time, but I decided after failing the exam, I thought, well, now what do I do? And fortunately, Janice Snook, the chairperson at the time at the University of South Florida's Political Science Department, she offered me a job teaching as an instructor, teaching Intro to IR and Intro to American. And I fell in love with teaching. And so with that then, with the master's finished, this opportunity by a wonderful feminist, I decided, and then also encouragement from my major professors, I decided to go on and get the PhD in political science IR. And again, at UMass Amherst, there were not many women who were certainly professors. Jean Elstein was there, but she was more political theory. But it was, there weren't too many women in the field at that time. I do recall vaguely attending an ISA conference as a graduate student. I went into the ISA archive yesterday to try and figure out when that conference would have been. It probably would have been in the Boston area, but I couldn't, the archive doesn't go back far enough, so I don't know for sure. But certainly once I finally finished my doctorate, and this was all in the 80s, mind you. So when I finally finished my PhD in 92, I then got very involved with ISA and found an academic home there.
Thank you all so much. Mary, that segues nicely into our next question, which is about what were your initial experiences at ISA in those times?
Well, I'll go again. I was an East European specialist, and so I always went to the Association of Slavic Studies, because that's what my books were on, Czechoslovakia and East European communism. So I didn't know, I had never heard of ISA, but I was in I think I was in a project with Lou Kreisberg, and he wanted the people in the project to come and do a panel at ISA. And I don't remember when this was, but it was in San Francisco. And so that was my first ISA meeting. I used to go to the Political Science Association, but that was a massive place. I didn't like it much. My home was in Slavic studies. And so I went to the Women's Caucus because I didn't know anybody. I literally did not know anybody except maybe one or two people that I'd met along the way. And I went to I went to the Women's Caucus because as a feminist, I figure this is where I should start. And it was very smart. I didn't know anybody, but everybody was very friendly and, exchanging names. They all knew each other. I didn't know any of them, but it worked. It was definitely the right thing to do because that became my home. That's where I felt at home. And I met like-minded women, and the problems were the same, and we understood each other, and it was fine. It was just the smartest thing I did, and that's been my home ever since. And, I belong to the Peace Studies section and the feminist section, but the Women's Caucus was really the right place for me, because if I wasn't doing feminist research, I was doing Soviet foreign policy mainly, this was the place. And I really believe it's the place for all the women in ISA, no matter what their specific field is. So that's what ISA was for me. I never miss a conference now. I love it. I'm active. And thank goodness there was a Women's Caucus. I say that to those of you who created it. It really was a good thing for me that you did.
Go, Susan.
No, it's true. I mean, it's a big organization. And if I had just gone to panels carrying my coat around because I was in a hotel down the street, I would have been miserable. But this was just the right thing for me to begin with. And then Katja nominated me to be a member at large, and I got involved and so on.
my initial introduction to ISA was in 1972 when ISA sponsored a workshop in St. Louis at Washington University. It was about teaching IR, and it was a week-long, expenses paid workshop. And I went, and I had a grand time, and I even visited the arts. But what that taught me was that the smaller gatherings, like a caucus, like section meetings, like regional conventions, like workshops, like the pre-conference workshops, are so important to our personal and professional growth and development.
Joe?
Yeah, I would say, my first ISA experience was in 1981 at a Western regional meeting in Denver. It was shortly after I had moved to the mountains of Colorado in 79 and was teaching part-time at University of Colorado at Denver. But I agree with you, Susan, that really and truly it's the smaller gatherings. When I finally went to Penn State with my first tenure line position, as Meredith and others know, was really involved in the Northeast Regional and met wonderful people like Ann Tickner and Hayward Alker and folks like that ended up being just amazing mentors and supporters through some pretty unhappy times for me. Meredith, when you were talking about your pay, it reminded me that when I went to Penn State, I was a single mom of two boys, recently divorced. Although when I interviewed there, of course, everybody on the search committee, because they were all men, all really old men, asked me, well, what would your husband possibly do in State College? So anyway, that's a different story altogether. But on the pay score, so I was hired, two of us were hired at the same time. A man who was married to a lawyer and they had no children. And then I was the single mom of two kids, but because he had a family, he got paid more.
Jesus.
Was the rationale that I got. It was not very pleasant. But yeah, going back to the smaller section meetings, the caucus, what I had written in, the wonderful thing about the caucus is it doesn't matter what your field is, as Galia said. I mean, everything is there. Everybody is there. Every discipline and field is represented there. But it's the relationships that you build that make it so meaningful, and they become your support network during good times and bad. So strong recommendation to keep going to those smaller meetings and the business meetings of the sections that you belong to. That's also where you build really important relationships.
Well, my experience was similar in terms of becoming involved in the regionals and the Political Science Association. But when I was a graduate student, I was the only woman really studying IR and US foreign policy. And so if I went to, I used to go to ISA all the time, and I hated it, absolutely hated it, because I would be the only woman on in the room. I would be the only woman on a panel. The other panelists would all socialize, go out, do things. They would, completely ignore me most of the time. And it was a very lonely, sort of disenchanting place to be. But I did become involved in the Political Science Association, and that was a little more welcoming. They already had an established caucus at the time, and
free childcare.
Well, yes, and childcare things. But one of the things I started doing with the Women's Caucus in political science was starting to look at the location of women. And a colleague and I started doing research on the status of women in political science first. And we looked, and our basic assumption, sort of before going in, was that women were going to be clustered at the lower ranks They were going to be in part-time positions. They were going to be in gypsy positions, and that the men would be clustered in the higher ranks of the profession. And so we started looking at these figures. And at the time, give or take, of full professors, only 6% in the organizations were women. And one of the problems we had, and we had we were very successful. The Political Science Association published some of our research and was relatively welcoming of our attempts to look at the status of women. The International Studies Association was not. And the International Studies Association would not even count the number of women in the organization. They did not ask for sex or gender questions when people registered, et cetera. So they had no idea of how many people were in the organization. So I did some work going through the membership directories, figuring out how many were women, did some work looking at the programs, trying to figure out what women were doing in the organization, et cetera. And the organization really did not want this kind of information. I couldn't get it published in the ISA journals, et cetera. And it was only because really of Hayward Alker and Ann Tickner that they started to have an opening for women. And as Vicki mentioned, we met them at the Northeast ISA meetings, and they were very helpful, mentoring to people, encouraging us to become involved. And it was only with Hayward and Ann's impetus that we finally created a committee to look at the status of women in international studies. And at about that time, I was also involved with Ann in terms of trying to create the feminist studies section. And I enjoyed that group, but I had the sense that it only appealed really to people who were doing feminist theory. And that it would be nice to have another caucus that would be open to women in all areas. And so that sort of fed into the impetus that I felt in terms of working on creating the caucus, joining the caucus when it was created. And so I think that was very instrumental, I think, in terms of the organizational structure, getting more women involved as officers in the organization, et cetera. And so it's been very instrumental for me anyway in making ISA a place that I can tolerate most of the time.
Well, this is very interesting. So yeah, to piggyback on that, as I had mentioned earlier, I couldn't really remember having attended an ISA conference during graduate school, although I'm pretty sure I did. But I took a job at Eckerd College, ABD, and teaching full-time and trying to write a dissertation was not a good idea. So it took me a bit longer to finish than it might have otherwise. And it was really very stressful time for me. Plus my mother passed away in the midst of all that. In any case, happy ending. Finally, I finished my dissertation and I felt free. So I would go to APSA, I would go to LASA, I would go to ISA, but especially at ISA, because APSA was I found very patriarchal, and walking down the hallway at APSA and, just the guys would knock
what is ATSA? Mary, what is ATSA?
APSA, American Political Science
APSA.
Association.
Oh, okay.
Sorry. Yeah, I just felt like the guys, I was invisible and they would just knock into me as I'd be walking down the hall. But it was a little different at ISA. And the first big ISA conference I really remember was the joint conference with Mexico in Acapulco. And I ran into Susan Northcutt at the airport, and then and so we talked. I didn't know her well from my time at USF, but I knew her, and we talked and kind of clicked. And but at that Acapulco conference in '92, I felt so free. I no longer had to go to the panels that only dealt with my dissertation topic. I could explore for the first time. So I found critical theory panels and I found the feminist panels, and I fell in love. And I got involved then with feminist theory and gender studies, not because I did feminist work at that time, but I was curious about it. And this was just the time then, 92, 93, 94, that the special study on the status of women that Meredith just mentioned was getting underway, that Hayward Elker and Jan Tickner were kind of pushing, and then Meredith and Karen Erickson and Marie Hennehan and Chris Sylvester came together as a group to really do a path-breaking study on the status of women in the profession. And coming out of that study then, whatever that year was, 94 perhaps, we met, and I remember, hearing about the results of the survey or the studies, the 4-part study. And the question arose then, what do we do? This was in the feminist theory and gender studies section. What do we do with this data? And so the discussion started about, do we create a caucus? Do we work outside of the ISA or inside of the ISA? And I volunteered to look at other professional associations to see what they do, and would report back the following year. And that was then the year that we decided to form the caucus. So I came in after the groundwork that Meredith and Susan and Vicki had kind of done, kind of breaking those furrows, right? And and so from there we decided to create the caucus.
Thank you.
So our next question was actually, I think maybe been addressed, but it's about how were you involved in ISA to create these experiences to make ISA more accessible to women? So I wondered if maybe, Susan, you want to start off by maybe sharing any stories or things that you had to deal with as you co-created the caucus for us.
The founding of the caucus in 1995, 96 was our first formal meeting. I remember the discussion at the governing council meeting in April of 1996. And this was the meeting of the movers and shakers that would make the caucus legitimate and credible. I was hoping. Well, the discussion was very robust, and I have some notes from that session, and let me share them with you. 3 objections were raised. 1, president, other groups will follow, and where will it end? The second one, no special group for women is needed. This is much ado about nothing. The third one, why should the Women's Caucus be a section as a group of scholars and practitioners in a specialized area of IR?
Oh, Jesus.
And generally, the discussion was that the caucus challenged the meaning and integrity of a section.
Oh,
Think of that claim.
oh.
Ultimately, of course, we prevailed, and the motion to create the Women's Caucus as a section of ISA passed by a very comfortable margin. The politics at that meeting, at the governing council meeting, the politics were very intense. They were largely ideological, gender-based, and ultimately, I think we were pioneers in the creation of a new kind of structure, that is the caucus.
Thank goodness you did.
And in fact, if I could just interject, Susan, I think you came up with the term constituent unit.
Mhm.
Because
Yes.
the caucus wasn't exactly an academic section. It was
No.
a slightly different animal. And you're so brilliant at constitutions and so on. You came up with this term, constituent
Yeah.
unit, and they couldn't argue with that.
That's right. Yeah. Uh-huh.
I have to laugh because so much of this was, I created the Women's Studies program in Israel, the first one. And the comments were very similar at the faculty meeting that had to approve it, very similar. And we couldn't, the word gender wasn't around, and we couldn't call it Women's Studies. It would never been accepted. So we called it the sex program in sex differences in society. Sex. I thought that was wonderful. And we got it. And then later we were finally able to change the name, and we created a research center, which today has the word gender and women in it. By the way, just one other thing, my great good luck was that at a conference in America, I met one of the members, the trustees of the university, an American who was the treasurer of the trustees. And he wanted to, for various family reasons, he wanted to support women's studies. And that's how we got it. That's how we ultimately got our institute, because they couldn't argue with him. He was treasurer of the trustees. So we got our named after him, the Fred and Barbara Lafer Center for Gender and Women's Studies. That's the one way to go.
Yeah. So Susan, I remember and I think Meredith was there too, and Mary maybe. I remember that governing council meeting because I was on the governing council. I was vice president-elect at the time, and then in 96, 97, I was vice president. And it was, yes, I think it's very fair to say that it was a robust and ridiculous conversation.
Absurd in so many ways, as we now look at it, yes.
Yeah, I'm so glad you kept those notes because as you were mentioning, I was sort of having, PTSD or something from that experience. But
Susan Strange chaired that governing council meeting, by the way.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. Wow. Well, she was a character. So one of the things that really helped me in the early days, although my experience is very similar to Mary's with regard to the APSA, American Political Science Association, but they did have free childcare, and that was critically important to me. My kids, when I started my tenure track position, were 4 and 9, and I was a single mom. I couldn't just leave them. So we would go together, and I would be able to take advantage of that free daycare. So one of the things that I worked on endlessly, although without as much success as I had hoped, but in 2001, I was asked to chair the child care task force at ISA, and we got something out of it. We didn't get, totally free childcare, which I think is still a goal. Maybe it has been achieved at this point. But that was one thing that I thought was really important for us to be able to establish, to be friendly to people, whether they were single moms or single dads or a married academic couple who needed childcare. So.
I think that both, Susan and Vicki have mentioned the opposition to the issue of including women in the organization, but I think that they've actually been too nice about the whole thing. I'm sorry. But the opposition to the Committee on the Status of Women was intense.
Yes, it was.
They did not want it created. The discussion at the governing council at the time was very personally offensive.
It was ugly.
Yes.
Mean-spirited.
We were going to destroy the organization by allowing a discussion of dissension within the organization, since we had a different point of view that was going to destroy it. And when we first started, and even in the Political Science Association, when my colleagues and I would present some of these findings, we would always have men in the audience who would get up and yell and scream at us that we were traitors, all kinds of nasty things. And even in the International Studies Association, the Governing Council finally approved the Committee on the Status of Women. And we did this multi-pronged look. Marie Hennehan and I did the statistical analyses, and Christine Sylvester was doing the stories. Karen Erickson was looking at women in the association. And we tried ultimately to get ISA to publish the findings of our study. They commissioned this whole it was a 3-year study. They commissioned this wonderful crowd of women to do it, and then the organization would not publish it. We were rejected in all of the ISA organizations. The editor, who happened to be actually someone I knew, wrote back this delightful note to us saying that the status of women is not of interest to ISA members. And so they would not publish any of the findings of the reports. And so all of this work basically languished. Finally, after some pressure, they published some brief little synopses in the newsletter kind of thing. But other than that, it never saw the light of day. And so it was a very trying period for us. And at this time, we're talking about the figures of full professors who are women were like 7%, right? Very small numbers. And so women were not normally in positions of power at this range. And so we ended up doing a follow-up study, and 5 years later, and we basically looked at what at that time was emerging was the backlash against women. And it was not only when we present papers at ISA, you'd get a couple of men who would really be obnoxious about it, but also you'd hear it in articles that were being written by men in the field. And so the whole backlash period in the mid-90s became very problematic for us. So the caucus was sort of a refuge, was a place we could sort of, gather support, which we weren't going to get from the organization.
Go ahead. One more thing on the study, and then kind of what happened after that. I remember taking the survey for the study, the questionnaire survey, and there were questions on there about, have you ever experienced sexual harassment? And it was kind of like a light bulb went off, because yes, in graduate school I had, received unwanted advances from a professor, and it really kind of, it was a conscientization kind of experience for me that I think also led me to check out the FTGS, and when the report came out then, when the study came out, and even though the ISA wouldn't publish the report, there were copies of the report circulating within FTGS and other women who came to these meetings and the breakfast meeting that we had eventually. So there are copies around that did circulate. But I was not able to attend that meeting where the Governing Council finally approved the caucus's bid to become a constituent unit of the ISA. I was away with students at our London campus, so I wasn't able to go to ISA that year. But I was delighted when Susan told me that everything had been approved. And when I got back from London, then Susan and I kind of sat down, and I guess we had already written a draft of the Constitution, Susan?
Yes, we had. Yes, it had to be. That was part of our package presented to the Governing Council.
Right, but then we wrote the new agenda recommendation.
Yes.
For the ISA. based on the results of the survey and the
Right.
coming together of the Women's Caucus.
Mhm.
And part of the new agenda recommendations was to create sort of a standing committee on the status of women. And I remember that was shot down by the governing council for the same reasons as the previous ones mentioned. And I remember being so angry at that, and at a Women's Caucus breakfast meeting then saying, we'll be our own committee on the status of women. We'll do our own monitoring of how the ISA is implementing, these recommendations. So yeah, they were very interesting times.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I just wanted to get in a perspectives question, and then we can turn to Holly's questions as well. But we're also very interested to see, what is your current take or view of women's participation and representation at ISA or in international studies?
Well, a couple of times I've done, and a couple of friends of mine have looked at some studies on the participation of women. And one of the things that has bothered us a little bit is the way that women are, I don't want to say ghettoized, but in a sense, in certain areas. And if you look at women's participation through the program, you'll find that women's participation really is clustered in feminist theory panels and panels having to do with gender, and where you'll get whole panels of women, and areas still, the high IR kind of panels tend to generally be virtually all male unless you get one woman put in, because there is pressure now from ISA. And this has been part of the Committee on the Status of Women's efforts. But ISA does have a rule that you're supposed to try and include a woman on panels, that they have for a couple of years not accepted all male panels. How successful that is, I'm not entirely sure. But women have made great progress in terms of at least academic ranks and things, which has been very gratifying for us to see anyway.
I think you raise a really important point there, Meredith, and it kind of goes back to building relationships in smaller groups, whether it's the Women's Caucus and or the smaller business meetings of whatever section you belong to. Because if you can work your way into governing council and then to become chair of those sections, you have or the program chair, you have the opportunity to make sure that the representation on panels are to the best of your ability. You don't always have complete control over all of it. But I found that several times I was the chair or the program chair of different sections, and I found it really wonderful to be able to make sure that there was appropriate representation on the panels.
Yeah, I think the caucus's efforts in terms of trying to encourage women to apply for ISA positions has been very important. I know those efforts were definitely important in terms of getting Ann Tickner to become ISA president. And I know have been important since, just to get your name out there. It's amazing how many awards and positions at ISA are given out when the competition is among 3 or 4 people, because nobody wants to put their name out there.
Yeah.
And along with that, suggesting to incoming presidents or president-elects, a slate of women willing to serve on committees.
Yes.
Campus, crucial.
Such great advice. Anna, I see you have a question.
Actually, it's not a question, but I just would like to thank you, all of you. Hi. Although it's virtual, it's so good to see all of you. I just would like to thank everyone, who started the Women Caucus and continue with the hard work. Certainly being part of the Women Caucus changed completely my perspective on our discipline and on my career, having Mary as a mentor and a friend, a dear friend, has been incredible. I don't know where I would be without you and without the
Great.
Caucus. So,
Great.
and this is,
Excellent.
and I
Great.
think Anwar has a very similar experience because we meet in the Caucus and we are the same generation. And so thank you for all the hard work. And I just would like, I don't know, to make a suggestion or to trim together with you if it would be amazing if all of this history would be available, all the documents, all the comments you made would be registered, I don't know, in a book, in a special issue, because as some of you might know, I was based in Brazil and we started there the proposal to make a women caucus in our association, and it's well, it's going good right now. We have the proposal ready after 5 years of discussion. And one of the things that was important for us was to say, look, the ISA has a women caucus. It has a feminist and theory section. And this is how they did. So I'm sure, and now I'm based in Colombia and the discussion doesn't even begin here. So it would be really helpful to have all of this document. And from that perspective, but also now that I'm teaching IR theory, I always, when I'm teaching feminist theory, I always say, well, you have to understand that at the same time, there was this movement, this advocacy for the space and the participation of women in international relations. And I always explain the creation of the Women Caucus, and would be amazing if we have more systematically this information available. So just thank you. So good to see you, even virtual. I always, feel very inspired talking to you.
Thank you, Anna. I know we're on the same page because we are working towards providing archives for our members. And I know that Susan has a treasure trove of documents that she would like to transfer to us. I think it's just a great thing that we definitely need to have. In addition to, we have the oral history film and clips that are coming out again this year. But I agree, we need to collect all of this great, rich data and information. And I echo your sentiment too. Like, I can't thank you all enough for founding the caucus, for your work in advancing women, and for sharing your stories with us. I just feel so grateful to be here right now. And it is, we're moving forward on your shoulders, really. Thank you so much. Does anyone have any final comments or words, or shall we just give them a round of applause? Either, with this or our Zoom reactions.
Yeah, if I can just echo
Yes.
that, Jennifer, I just want to say too that I think one of the great things about the caucus has been the women reaching out to us individually as well. And so my first ISA meeting, I was lucky to be at a table with Susan Northcutt, and she turned to me and said, "Volunteer for something." And then I was going up for tenure and at a women's mentoring event, and Mary and Vicky both just handed me their cards, and no questions asked to have their support. And so I just appreciate that so much, and I just am really, as Jennifer said, really glad to be a part of this group and bearing the burden of responsibility, I guess, for moving us forward. But thank you so much for all you've done, for being in those meetings and standing up for us, for all those that would come after you too. That's just so meaningful, and hopefully we will pay it forward. I think that's the big challenge for us is paying it forward. So thank you very much.
Yes, and Jamie, by the way, is our next chair. So we look forward to her.
Okay.
Yes.
I volunteered, Susan, so I lived up to it.
Well, thank you, everyone. Wish you well. Be well. Contact us for any other suggestions. That was a great one from Anna. And I hope you have a great conference next week, too.
Thank you for all your hard work organizing all of this.
Yes,
Ditto.
thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you.
Stellar job.
It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for
Absolute
taking up
pleasure.
the torch. Both you and Jamie. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Good night. Bye-bye.
Bye.